2017 was a pretty big year in gaming. Lots of what are now considered large titles were released during this time. Think things like PUBG, Destiny 2, Red Dead Redemption 2, Nier Automata, and, maybe Resident Evil 7. Just to name some of the highlights for that year, for better or for worse. Also, hey, that's when the Switch was released, so, that's neat. Yeah, Nintendo was having a monstrous year in 2017. With the release of the Switch, came with it The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, one of the greatest launch titles that system could have ever really hoped for. During its launch window, Mario Kart 8 also came out. And it's funny to me that both of those games are still kind of living in the current usage of the Switch. Granted, Breath of the Wild got its sequel, so it's no longer Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. But Mario Kart 8 is still getting DLC, or at least you can still buy it. I think they finally wrapped up with the expansion course, or whatever they called it. I can't really recall. But yeah, two of the launch titles still going strong. At some point during 2017, there was a Nintendo Direct. Everybody loves watching those. And during that specific Direct, there was a trailer. That trailer was for Metroid. It had been, almost 15 years, if you round up, since the last 2D Metroid came out, and I guess 7 since Other M had come out. Samus was kind of back, taking up some of the spotlight. Would this be a continuation of the main storyline? People were wondering as the trailer played. Initial reactions were fairly positive, if not maybe somewhat confused. The Switch had been out at this point for almost half a year, but for some reason the game was on the Nintendo 3DS? It would have been nice if it were on the Switch, but, for fans of Metroid, it really didn't matter that much. We were just excited to see Samus in something that wasn't Smash Brothers. The trailer reaches its end. The title drops. Metroid. Samus returns. It's a remake? At this point, people were kind of split. Still excited, but split. Questions were making some rounds. Why a remake? Why now? And who was Mercury Steam? And can they deliver on a Metroid game? Let's take a look at all of that. Get some ideas as to the why and how. How's it going, everyone? Glad to have you all here for this milestone on the channel, and with great appreciation for you all, and with all the excitement I can manage, I'm happy to once again say, my name is Leon, and I welcome you all back to the Metroid Retrospective. So, have you heard of a developer called Mercury Steam? I imagine at this point you have. I mean, I've talked about them more than a few times at this point. But, up to this point in history, they were kind of on the lesser known side. They've made a bunch of games. Some good, others, getting there. Being that their development studio is set in Spain, they were relatively on, the smaller side. One of those if you know types of things, Look, the point is they have a history, and for the most part, that development history is pretty good. At this point in time, the last few games they were working on were Castlevania-related, Lords of Shadow 1 and 2, and the DS game Mirror of Fate. They were in deep on the rebooted Castlevania series, which is honestly kind of funny and a little interesting if you ask me. While the first few titles in the rebooted Castlevania series were more Devil May Cry and, less Metroid or even really Castlevania, they were something kind of new. But they did play with the idea of a more traditional Metroidvania-style game, which is eventually what led to Mirror of Fate. The Mercury Steam crew, at some point, developed a prototype, Metroid Fusion, remaking that game and showing it to Nintendo. Nintendo loved it so much, in fact, that they shot it down, and instead paired up with them to work on a Metroid 2 remake, and this is what brings us here. Metroid 2 had long been requested to be remade by longtime fans of the series, for obvious reasons. The first game had already been remade, see Metroid Zero Mission for that, or, maybe look at that video after this one. Anyway, Metroid 2 was one that needed the most help. It is, more or less, the key entry in the series, and without it, the rest of the games can't really take place. Seeing that they worked well in this style of game, Nintendo were more than happy to drop Samus off with them. I mean, it couldn't really get much worse than it was for the Metroid series as a franchise. Okay, so that's kind of like the why Mercury Steam, right? So now the question comes, why the 3DS and not the Switch? Well, apparently it was because Mercury Steam and their last release, which was Mirror of Fate, was another 3DS title. Nintendo wanted to aim for players who were kinda already familiar with Mercury Steam games, specifically on that 3DS platform. And they just announced Metroid Prime 4 for the Switch, which is still, as of recording, not out yet, but it's soon. It'll be here soon. Very much still looking forward to that release. Anyway, the Switch was still fairly new at the time, and the 3DS had a pretty large adoption rate, so numbers-wise, it made sense. But I think we can all kind of look back and agree that maybe the Switch would have been the better choice. I don't know. I just think the game is going to suffer a similar fate to its original. Fun, important, but ultimately forgotten on a handheld. Oh, another fun thing, and perhaps the thing that most fans of the game are aware of, is that prior to the release of this game, a fan project known as Another Metroid 2 Remake, or AM2R for short, was sent a DMCA takedown from Nintendo. We'll talk more about that some other time, but man, what a blow to the fan base that is. So the stage was set. Mercury Steam had worked their way into working onto the Metroid series, and honestly, all told, they did a pretty good job. So much so that they would go on to eventually create Metroid Dread. Now, these games aren't perfect, they have some problems for sure, but we had seen worse. Or at least what we've perceived as worse in the series. So to have a few proper Metroid games back, and they're pretty solid all around, that's a win. Because it opens up the possibility for future games in the series. Ultimately, the creative leads for both Mercury Steam and Nintendo, one Jacobo Luengo and Yoshio Sakamoto, took charge of their teams and delivered one of the better 3DS games to come out near the end of that thing's life cycle. Critically, it has strong A average in terms of scoring from traditional reviewers, and I can see where they're coming from. The game itself is very fun and definitely holds its own. The fan base, however, remains, well, about as split as ever. I like it. It has its flaws, but it's still a pretty good game at the end of the day. Might just be a bit awkward in places, Remakes are interesting things. It's tough to nail down exactly what people liked about the game in its original form. Depending on who you ask and when you ask them, you can get a wide assortment of answers. Most common, however, I think anyway, you get the response of, I just want to have the game stay the same, just make it more visually appealing, or, something along those lines. There was a lot of that with the remake of Final Fantasy VII, though that's a topic in and of itself for me to take a look at much later down the line. When looking at the term remake, you need to figure out what kind of ideas you want to explore within that terminology. Should it be a one-to-one revamp of the original source material? Should it be something that kind of rhymes with the original? And by that I mean, should it be similar enough where people look at it and say, oh yeah, I remember that, or that's how it always looked in my head, while adding in small quality of life updates? Should it be an entire reimagining of the source material, where everything is still there technically, but it's been adapted to flow or play better with added mechanics and new spaces to venture into? Or, more importantly, it's been changed to fit with the story that has since evolved from the original's place in time. Lastly, there's a new take on what a remake can be, and that comes from the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where the whole of the story is remade, and remade to be meta and somewhat self-aware of itself, in a sense. Hold on to these ideas, we're going to be circling back to those. One of the best remakes, in my opinion, of all time was the Resident Evil 1 remake on the original GameCube back in 2002. Known throughout the community as Remake, it brought the old PS1 game out of its B horror status and made it more, well, of itself, I guess, if that makes any sense. You can see more of the original intent of what the game was trying to be, but just couldn't because of all the PS1 jank and, low polygons. That is to say, there's nothing wrong with the original version. It holds a place near and dear to me and many others, but the remake did make changes. It's very much a reimagining type of remake. The remake of Link's Awakening is, to me, more along the lines of one that has a rhyming style of remake. Things that are mostly the same, but it is just a bit different. Changed in ways that add quality of life enhancement for the player, keeping the sword on its own button, having more face buttons to use in general for more equipment, less loading between the spaces, and things of a similar nature to that. If you want an example of a one-to-one remake, look no further than the Super Mario Bros. All-Stars, way back on the SNES, or, the Wii if you got that 25th anniversary pack. Those games were remade to be on the Super Nintendo, with updated visuals and really not much else. Nothing wrong with that, at all. But, while they are fun, it makes me wish there was just maybe more to them, Now, to me, personally, Samus Returns sits in the reimagined category that I made up just now. I don't think there's anything wrong with that for a few reasons, one of which is the original is always going to be a thing. If, for some reason, the remake doesn't really jive with you, you can always go back and play the original if you want. Now, that said, if a remake does its job well, it can make people want to go back and see what made the original worth remaking in the first place. In the case of Return of Samus, that's a pretty large undertaking for people who don't really like the original Game Boy game aesthetic. Like it or not, the original version of Return of Samus is not very player-friendly, which is kind of funny to me because that game is absolutely pivotal to the story as a whole and understanding it as a player. One thing to keep in mind while getting into the philosophy of what is a remake, no matter what the type is that the developers of these games can only do so much. They can't please every type of player. They need to aim for some kind of middle ground. It may be alienating for longtime fans of the series, but for as much as these games are meant for us, they are arguably meant more for people who have heard of these games and want to try them out, but never got the opportunity. And that is never a bad thing. Games are, in my opinion at least, meant to be fun. And I'll be honest with y'all, I had more fun with Samus Returns over Return of Samus, and I'm about as deep into Metroid as you can be. I mean, I've got 3-4 hours of Metroid videos alone here on this channel so far, with more on the horizon? I don't think my status as a fan can be argued. I have the Samus Returns 3DS, the big box set for Dread, and a bunch of Samus amiibo. If I were to get more people into Metroid as a whole, I would not, under any circumstances, give them the original Metroid 2, until they've established a genuine fondness for the series. Samus Returns is a much more player-friendly experience, and that is what a remake ought to be, right? Alright, this game does a lot to update the Game Boy original. Not only does it have a fresh coat of paint, but a ton of new gameplay mechanics that were introduced here. two of which are hopefully going to stay as things progress in this 2D style of games. Those being the free aim and the counter ability. Though, the counter has its own problems, we'll get to that here in a minute. The free 360-degree aiming for Samus's arm cannon and missiles started here. Being that this game was on the new 3DS, you had a few options in terms of how you wanted to control it. You can either use the D-pad, circle pad, and face buttons to control the game, or you can try using the touchscreen and the numerous options in between. You want my advice though? Get comfortable with that touchpad. You'll be using that a little more often than you think. It controls the arm beams, the missiles, and even the grappling hook. And while we're on the topic of the arm beams, they stack, but with one major exception. The ice beam is its own thing, which means if you want to use it, you need to select it, and the game has a habit of making you select things from the bottom screen constantly. Not a bad problem if you're playing on the hardware as intended, but a bit of a pain point if you try to play it on something like an emulator. Honestly, I wish I could say I got good at the hot swapping with the mouse, but honestly, it's not as easy as it probably could have been. Such is the fate of the DS family of systems. Gotta make use of all the options. Because you end up fighting Metroids constantly, you'll need to swap to that ice beam. Now, you don't need to, I should say that now, but the ice beam is too good to not use on those Metroids. You can just take out all of them that aren't the classic looking versions with missiles, but if you use the ice beam, you can shut down some of the more powerful attacks that they use. I know that they made this choice mostly because they wanted the player to have to cycle between the beam types. That said, if they hadn't made that change, the ice beam would be the only thing you needed to use, ever. So that stacked with the plasma beam and on top of all the others would have been way too much. It would have been way overpowered. Plus, and a nice kind of nod to the original, in this way it's kind of like you get to pick what weapon you want to use for what encounter. Kind of like you could go back and pick up the random arm cannon you wanted to use for whatever section you were on. It's a little odd, but that's what they went with, so, you know, whatever. Now, strange 3DS controls aside, the game plays very well. Samus takes up a good section of the screen and flows with all the fluidity that makes sense for her character. We'll see this movement updated in Dread down the line. On that subject, Samus does everything she needs to. That 360-degree aiming? So good. Works perfectly. Her jump height and weight is about as good as it gets, though that gets upgraded in Dread as well. As far as how you control Samus goes, this game is really second only to Dread, which is no surprise really. I imagine this was sort of a test run for Mercury Steam, you know? Samus Returns also introduces Aeon abilities. These would get expanded on later in Dread, but the powers themselves got a good start here. They come in 4 flavors. You have Pulse, Lightning Armor, Beam Burst, and Phase Drift. Pulse lets you scan the area for hidden blocks and alternate pathways if you need that help. It also expands the map on your map screen. It comes in pretty handy. The Lightning Armor makes it so you don't really take any damage. The damage you do take gets absorbed by the Aeon Gauge. It's needed for certain areas and puzzles, and perhaps even some certain fights if you want that extra little bit of insurance. The Beam Burst lets you overclock the beam cannon and fire faster and with more damage per shot. Good for those mechanical foes and things that take a lot of punishment. Phase Drift slows time down around Samus, almost acting as a sort of reverse speed booster, if that makes any sense. It's great for those puzzles with those breakaway platforms, as well as giving you some extra time to deal with tougher foes. Oh, right, Samus can wall jump, but it works like it did in Fusion. And that is wall to wall. You can't really one-wall much of anything. And while we're on the topic of that, there are plenty of teleporters and elevators to take while on SR388. These are a godsend. In the original, if you needed to go back to an earlier spot, you would have to walk the entire way. A real pain point if you run out of missiles in the last area fighting those Omega Metroids. Not so much here. These teleports can take you as close as you need to be to a lot of critical places on the map. Right, the map. Much like the original, you'll get deeper and deeper into the planet by taking out Metroids. You can see how many you need to take down at these statues. These locks were made to hold back those Metroids. They hold a bunch of purple acid in check and make it so no one can, or rather should, get deeper into the planet for their own sake and safety. A sort of last-ditch effort from the Chozo to protect everyone from the Metroids. As a Chozo warrior, sort of, you can interface with these and it'll highlight how many you need to take out. Much better than the pause screen on the lower side panel count that the old game used to have. These Metroids are the primary bosses that you'll be encountering. That's not to say that you can't or won't fight other things, but the Metroids are the main focus. Much like the original though, it gets to be maybe a bit much after a while. The rush of each new type of Metroid is fun for the first few times, but by the end of it all, it loses some luster. That said, what picks up the fights a few levels of awesome is the counter mechanic. Counter does exactly what it sounds like. You can counter an attack back at the creature. It one-shots the small creatures you'll find basically everywhere. Bosses, though, if you manage a counter on them, you'll get a very cinematic sequence where you can just let loose with beams and missiles. And if done correctly, you can absolutely ruin some of the tougher monsters and bosses with fairly minimal effort. It is extremely powerful. Almost too powerful. The main issue here is that it more or less steals the show in terms of how you combat normal creatures. You can't just shoot them with missiles or beams, but why do that when you can just smack them upside the head a little bit and follow up with a beam strike for that guaranteed knockout? You wouldn't. And that's the major issue. Doing the melee counter makes Samus come to a complete stop and kills any momentum you may have had, and it's not really an issue on boss fights since you're in such an enclosed space, but on traversal, it kills the momentum big time. It's very cool though, and Mercury Steam more than makes up for that in Dread. The counter works infinitely better with the gameplay there. Here, it's rough, but it's still a neat and cool addition to the game as a whole. The presentation is much improved over the original, obviously, but the story flows so much better into the other games now, and the scenes in the game are just solid all around. Overall, it's a much improved version when compared to the original Game Boy game. Don't get me wrong, the original version will still have its place, but out of all the games that could have used a remake, this was the one. Well done, Mercury Steam, Nintendo. Well done, indeed. Hey, since you made it this far into the video, how about doing me a solid and giving it a bit of that attention YouTube likes to see? Yeah? Slap that like button, and perhaps maybe the subscribe button. Yeah? Nudge, nudge. I would appreciate it. Also, if you want to check out the other Metroid videos, there will be a card at the end of this one for the playlist, as well as a little pop-out thingy in the top corner over here, and that can take you to some other videos as well. Alright, thanks for indulging me a bit here. Let's get back to the video proper, yeah? So this one is a bit interesting in terms of its story, mostly because it's pulling double duty. It's both retelling the story from Return of Samus, as well as adding to it, and honestly, it adds quite a bit. The context for Samus being sent to SR388 is much improved. The backstory of the Chozo gets an update and is greatly expanded. Now, it might not feel that way, but looking back at the story from the manual of Return of Samus, honestly, we barely get anything in terms of what the Metroids are, other than they exist on SR388. Now, from a technical standpoint, it wouldn't be until much later in the series that we, as players, learn the Metroids were created by the Chozo for the purposes of dealing with the X parasite. Though that exists in the Fusion game manual, Super Metroid kinda hints that the Metroids themselves were created by an ancient civilization, but that's kinda about it. So this remake has to reconcile that difference, or at least give us a definitive version of events from the perspective of the game's own story, as well as the player's perspective on the events. We have all moved well on past the Federation made the discovery or anything like that. Stories tend to evolve and change as any series continues on. Unless, there's some sort of anthology, of course. Outside of that, Mercury Steam was looking to prove themselves and add to the Metroid story. A fine line to walk. Could they improve the original Return of Samus? Perhaps even fix story inconsistencies and add new context to the game as a whole? Well, time would tell. As for Samus, her mission remains the same when compared to the original version. She needs to land on SR-388 and exterminate the Metroids. They are too dangerous to get into the hands of space pirates, let alone anyone else who may or may not think along the same lines as them. Landing on the surface is easy enough. The planet's surface is about as good an intro as you could want. It still teaches the important mechanics of the game and does it quite well. In fact, the game as a whole is pretty well paced, I think. Each area has more and more to see and explore. Some areas even have multiple of those Chozo Metroid counters. The only way to progress is to take those things out and lower that acid level. Every new area that you venture into gets more complex in terms of its overall layout. In that complexity, though, comes the fun that most Metroid games are known for, and that is simply the exploration of it all. I can't be the only one that likes the back and forth, right? Like, normally backtracking in some games can be a bit of a drag, but in certain titles like Metroid, that backtracking is just part of what makes the game fun. Going back into earlier places and just ripping through them like a hot space knife through some space butter to find all those little secrets and nooks and crannies. That said, however, it leaves one somewhat glaring issue, and more on that when we get closer to the end. Outside of the intro and some story bits, you're not going to find much in the ways of direct storytelling, but if you pay attention to the places and environments you traverse, you can kind of piece together what happened here on SR-388. Sure, the intro lays out the overall plot and stuff, but the more hidden details lie in the environment, like these Chozo locks. The area in which the acid exists is nothing but rock and other minerals. There's really not much in the way of plant life, or any animals, really. With each passing layer, though, you find more and more Chozo temples. You start to understand how they sustained their lives down here. The deeper you go, the more destroyed each set of ruins and pathways are, as if to hint that some sort of battle kinda happened. Was it a long fight over many months or years? Or was it something that was quick and over almost as soon as it started? When the Chozo realized they were fighting a losing battle, did they just abandon everything wholesale? What caused the most powerful race of spacefaring people to leave this planet? Or did something else happen entirely? These are the types of questions that Samus must have been wondering as she makes her way deeper into the planet. Alpha Metroids made way to Gammas, then Zetas, and lastly Omegas. Each new part of the Metroid life cycle gives them new powers and makes them more and more ferocious to fight. Don't worry though, you'll get plenty of practice with each of these versions. Plus, if you're good with the whole counter and ice beam, you can shut down a lot of the abilities that the Metroids have. Weirdly, I think the Zeta form is the toughest one to fight. The Omegas are stronger, sure, and they do hit harder overall, but the Zetas move around a lot more and are overall just a bit more difficult because of that. Plus, the Zetas are boss fights that utilize the grapple beam in combat, and that, in and of itself, is just a fun idea. Like, of course, Samus could use that to mess things up. I mean, she's been doing that in Smash Bros. Since day one. During your journey, other bosses do show up, but they are way less frequent. One is very familiar, good old Arachnus. And one is kinda something entirely new. The Diggernaut, some old mining tech left by the Chozo. It's been aimless in its digging since the Chozo disappeared, and being that it's a mechanical being, the Metroids don't really pay any attention to it. This guy was a fun diversion for the few times it shows up. The actual boss fight has some great mechanics that don't usually get utilized in a fight. Spider ball, morph ball bombs, your skills as a human to recognize patterns and deal with the environment. It's tons of fun and a good way to break away from the other fights in the game. I only wish there were just more like this. We're going to draw a couple comparisons here. In the original game, the deeper you went into the planet, the less and less flora and fauna you would encounter. Things that weren't Metroids just kind of stopped showing up. Even the plant life just kind of stopped at some point. All the caves after a certain area were mostly lifeless. Only the real stubborn things existed in these final areas. In Samus Returns, though, some of the last few areas are absolutely packed with flora and fauna. That feeling of dread and isolation is lost a bit in this remake, almost as if the Metroids were not as large a threat as you would think. In fact, it's very odd there were only 40 of them on the counter. I mean, this is a very large planet, and yet there's only 40 in total? Why? There should be tons of them if they were really a problem. Now, part of this could be the work of the Chozo, sealing them deep in the planet where they might only be able to sustain a population of a certain size, but that just seems kind of odd. Also, why are the Omegas in the deepest parts? Shouldn't they be out trying to hunt the life on the surface of the planet? Surely they need more energy to sustain themselves. And yet, here they are, more or less living right next to the Queen. I would imagine the Queen needs the most energy given her size and what it is she does. She shouldn't have to compete with the biggest Metroids for sustenance. Unless something else is going on here that everyone is not yet aware of. These questions just continue to pile up as Samus moves deeper into the Chozo ruins, but then the ruins kind of give way to labs. Labs that have a lot of information on Metroids, more than even the space pirates had. Almost like the Chozo had created these things. For what purpose, though? There was no time to take a look at it all. The Metroid counter went from 1 to 9 really quickly. Everything seemed fine when Samus managed to take out that last Omega, but if more had been hatched, then there was no time to wait. With all the acid gone, they could escape to the surface and be almost impossible to hunt down. Luckily, these new Metroids are only in their larval state. This means they're easily taken out by the ice beam and just a handful of missiles. The hunt continues. Moving through those last areas, Samus takes out the newly hatched Metroids. The counter zeroing in on the last one, the Queen. Falling into her lair, Samus uses everything she has to take it down. Ice beam shots to the head, missiles to an open mouth, the grapple beam to knock her down, morph ball bombs to blow her core up. This pattern repeats a few times. With each repetition, the Queen grows more desperate. Until... the last Metroid is gone. With the Queen defeated, there would be no more Metroids on SR-388. Only there was an egg. Samus makes her way to it, and it hatches. The last known Metroid in existence. Samus makes a snap decision to spare this creature, as it doesn't attack her. In fact, it takes quite a liking to her. The newly hatched baby Metroid imprints on her, and together they make their way to the surface. Alright, so here's where things kind of derail a little bit. We'll close out the story soon enough, but hang with me here for a little while, please. If you're like me, then you try to get as many collectibles and power-ups as possible in the areas that you're in, but Samus Returns has an obscene amount of these crystals, just everywhere. Now, to anyone who's played the game, you know what these are. You know you need the baby to eat them and to open up the paths, but so many of these block off a ton of the pickups. It almost makes going back to collect items irrelevant. You might as well wait until you have the baby with you. I have some problems with this as a whole. I normally don't mind heading back into other areas in other Metroid games, and truth be told, I didn't exactly mind it here either, but it's still a problem. This late game item hunting is rough. Thankfully, even though you can't get everything the first time you make a trip through an area, there are these quick travel points, and these are a lifesaver. If you had to crawl back all the way on foot, this post-game item collection would not at all be worth it. Metroid Zero Mission and Fusion do this too. You can't get everything until you collect a certain power-up or find hidden paths between sectors. It was way more intrusive in Fusion because there is quite literally a point of no return, but I just don't really understand the point. If I'm able, through the means provided in the game, to get the power-up right now, then just let me. If I can think of a way to get around the puzzle, then let me get the reward. I don't mind backtracking at all, but when I get right to the end of the game and then get told, here's the thing you need because we said so, it kind of kills the momentum and pace of the game. Like, I just want to power through the last fight at full power, all the missiles, all the energy tanks, all the power bombs. When I get to the Queen Metroid, I should also be a queen in my own right, full power, and ready to test my mettle against the final boss. But no, we gotta have the baby to get this missile tank for some reason. It's a small nitpick, but it's an issue that Metroid, for some reason, continues to fumble on, even now. Small rant aside, if you do decide to do this, you can have some fun taking it slow. Plus, the baby teleports with you and rides on elevators. Honestly, it's a nice little detail to add. Once you get everything, or everything you really want to get, it's time to head up out of the Queen's Lair and back out onto the surface. The baby eats away the crystals, and, well, weirdly there's some energy and weapon refill stations. Strange, but okay, why not? When you get back to the ship, the final cutscene plays out and Samus gets attacked by Ridley! Woo! Why is Ridley here? I'll give you one guess. The thrill of it. Or, nostalgia? That's probably it. Oh, the fan service. Sorry, it was fan service. Story-wise, Ridley has really no reason to be here. Best guess as to why he shows up is because the space pirates already knew that Metroids existed on this planet. So I guess Ridley goes back to try and get one for, space pirate reasons, and just happens to run into Samus. Maybe. But it could also just be as easy as Ridley fight fun. And to be that guy, they're not wrong. This fight is why you probably should head back and maybe collect as much stuff as possible. What's really great is as the fight progresses, the baby goes from being a captive to being an observer to eventually being an active participant in Samus's fight. It only ends when you hit a counter on Ridley and lay into him with a ton of missiles and plasma bolts. Eventually, Ridley is defeated, and Samus and the baby make their escape. One of the only games to not have a countdown timer or have something explode. Weird. And that ends Samus's retelling of her adventure on SR-388. The last Metroid is in captivity, and the galaxy is at peace. Here we are, the last bit for me to think and speak on. I like the path that Mercury Steam took us on with this retelling of events. It's fun and certainly showcases what Metroid could be if Nintendo would like to experiment with the series, rather than have it on, the sidelines. It might not be the game that people wanted at the time, but it's a good entry into the series as a whole. The team at Mercury Steam did an amazing job bringing this game out from the depths of the Game Boy and into the hands of the people who had a 3DS. I only wish it was a Switch game and not stuck on the 3DS, but unfortunately it is what it is. If you have a new 3DS, I cannot recommend it enough. If you don't, well, then I wish you luck on trying to emulate it. It can be crazy disorienting to jump between controllers and the mouse for touchscreen aspects. All in all, it's a great game and a perfect way to bring Metroid back into the limelight. The few problems I do have with it don't really take away at all from the final product. The counter is busted, it kills your momentum. The bosses that aren't Metroids are fun, but too few. And the Metroid fights are great the first few times, and then they become Is it perfect? No, not at all. But it can be fun, and at the end of the day, that's what I look for in a game. Much like the original, this game is a creature all its own. If you just wait a little while and let it do its own thing, then maybe, just maybe, you'll find something that speaks to you. I know I did. So let's see where they take Samus and the Metroid franchise from here. If it's anything like this, where they take the time to let it do its own thing and on its own terms, then I can imagine the heights Nintendo and Mercury Steam can take Samus. Now, it's just a short wait until Metroid Prime 4. Been waiting on that one for quite some time. Wonder what I should do in the meantime. Maybe find another Metroid to play? Well, let's see what happens, yeah? Hey there everyone, welcome to the end screen. Thanks for getting this deep in. Here are some additional videos that reside in the realm of Metroid, if you haven't seen them yet. And here is something that YouTube recommends. Yeah. The next time I jump into Metroid will be for the Prime games. Alrighty then. That's it for now. I'll catch you all next time. Keep it clean.